Get started. So hello and welcome to today's Info2Go webinar. My name is Annie Gaines and I am the Continuing Education Consultant here at the Idaho Commission for Libraries, located in sunny Boise, Idaho. Our webinars and other continuing education opportunities are funded by the Institute of Museum and Library Services. Everyone is muted and we encourage you to use the chat feature to ask questions and discuss with other attendees. As you exit the webinar, you'll be prompted to complete an evaluation. And as always, we appreciate your honest feedback. Today's topic is service and emotional support animals, and our presenters today will be Ben Earwicker from the Idaho Human Rights Commission and Linda Lee from the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. Ben and Linda, please take it away.
Thank you, Annie, and thanks for inviting us to be here today. It's a pleasure to be with you. We're going to talk today about service and emotional support animals in the library, and we're going to actually focus on two titles of the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act. Title I, which has to do with employment. So those of you that are library employees or even volunteers, administrators, supervisors, and so on will get information about Title I and how that applies to the employment context. But also we're going to look at Title II for patrons coming into the libraries and how they're impacted by this and what you can and can't do when interacting with patrons. Now, I noticed that we've got some participants from outside of the state. Today we're going to talk both about state and federal laws. And for the state law, we're going to focus on Idaho's Human Rights Commission, Human Rights Act, and some other service animal statutes. Those of you in Virginia and Georgia and other states, Ohio, I see, Illinois, welcome today. You'll want to check with your local state laws to see how those may be different. Many are very similar. Most are based on the federal ADA, but there are some small differences from state to state. So we're going to jump right in. Welcome to Linda with the EEOC. Linda, do you want to give us a brief introduction?
It's a great pleasure to be here today with you all. I love libraries and librarians. You're my heroes. And so I'm so excited to partner with Ben Earwicker. We at EEOC enforce the employment aspect. So I'm here to learn today too a little bit more about the laws governing rules for public accommodations. And we're trying to make this as accessible and practical for you all as we can. So I hope we succeed.
Great, thanks, Linda. And as Annie mentioned, I'm Ben Earwicker. I'm the director of the Idaho Human Rights Commission. We are a state agency that enforces the Idaho Human Rights Act, which includes provisions for individuals with disabilities in employment, housing, education, and places of public accommodation. And through our work share agreement with the EEOC, we also assist in the enforcement of federal disability rights protections under the ADA through the work of the EEOC. So let's jump right in. I'm going to share my screen here. So first, we're going to talk about very briefly some definitions and service animals in public places. This is ADA Title II. This is also covered by a patchwork of state laws. So there are overlapping state and federal provisions. And so again, we'll try to touch on those a little bit. By the end of today, by lunchtime here in Idaho, you all will be experts on the definitions and the application of these state and federal laws in the library. So let's jump right in. First of all, we need to ask, do the laws about service animals apply to government agencies, to libraries, whether you're a state or local government agency? Yes, they do apply, and they apply in different ways than they would to a private business, to a housing authority or agency. And so we're going to talk about Title II and Idaho codes specifically, with some best practices of what to do, what not to do. And at the end of both of these presentations on Titles I and II, we're going to give you some resources that you can access, places to go when you have questions or when you need resources. So let's talk about, in this first section, how to deal with service animals in public agencies with patrons coming in. and then we'll redirect to some of those resources. Now, the second half of this, in fact, most of what we're going to talk about today is the intersection between public accommodation or public places and employment. And so we'll get into that in a few. So let's talk briefly about definitions. And this is really important to establish a baseline for understanding of what is a service animal and what is an emotional support or a comfort animal and how do they differ. So under the ADA, a service animal is very specifically a dog that has been individually trained to do work or perform tasks for an individual with a disability. Now, this is critical to understand that a service animal, and in most jurisdictions, that's a service dog, has to be trained to perform some task. Now, that differs from an emotional support, a therapy, a comfort, or a companion animal in that a companion, emotional support, or comfort animal is an animal that just simply provides comfort by being with its owner. Because they have not been trained to perform a specific task or a job, they don't qualify as service animals. And that really is the difference. So it boils down to this: a service animal performs a task, an emotional support animal or a comfort animal does not. They're merely there to provide comfort to the individual with them. Now, a little caveat, I want to explain what it means to perform a task. Now, this is from the ADA National Network. So a task is for the benefit of an individual with a disability, and that can include physical, sensory, psychiatric, intellectual, or other mental disabilities. So it's very broad what constitutes a disability and who may have a service animal. And those tasks can include pulling a wheelchair, retrieving dropped items, alerting a person to a sound, reminding a person to take medication, pressing an elevator button, alerting them to high or low blood sugar. All of those things are tasks that can be trained. Now, the other thing about state law is that state laws may be more expansive, but typically under the Constitution, they cannot be less expansive. So Idaho can't pass a law, in other words, that says, well, we see what you're doing, ADA, that's great and all, but we're going to limit it to fewer categories of disability and fewer situations. So states can't do that, but they can have more generous, more expansive laws. And in the case of Idaho, that is actually the case. So miniature horses may also be service animals in Idaho. Again, in Georgia, Ohio, different states that are joining us today, you might check your state statutes to find out if that's also the case. All right, so the question is, does the ADA apply to state and local governments? You'll see if you look at the ADA, Title III is for places of public accommodation. Now, those are private businesses that offer services to the general public. That's different from state agencies that are open to the public, but are considered different from places of public accommodation. But I just want to throw it out there that yes, the ADA covers state and local governments, and some federal agencies are also covered under Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. So we're going to come back to this as we talk about employment and places of public accommodation or public agencies. One question we get a lot is about service animals in training. Technically, under the ADA, service animals in training are not allowed in places of public accommodation or public spaces, so government agencies and locations like libraries. Now, again, states may have more expansive laws, which is also the case in Idaho, and we can talk more specifically in the chat about those laws. There are two questions that can be asked, and we're going to come back to those questions. By the end of today, I want you all to know and have memorized those two questions. Is this a service animal trained to perform a task for a person with a disability? And if so, what task does this animal perform? And we'll come back to that. There are various ways you can express that or say that, but those are the two questions. Thirdly, identification. There is no standard identification, whether that's a license or a vest, those simply are not required under federal law. And in fact, under Idaho state law, those are prohibited. So a business, or by extension, a state agency or library, can't ask if this dog is licensed or has a vest. Those are explicitly prohibited. Removal or exclusion: if a service animal, once you've established that it is a service animal, if the animal is not under its owner's control, is disruptive, barks at other patrons, they can be removed immediately, and you can ask that person to remove their animal. Again, whether or not it's a service animal, hopefully you've identified that it is and it's allowed in the facility. But if it's unruly or out of control, you can ask them to leave. And so in Idaho code, there are two provisions that I've listed there under Title 56 and Title 67. These are sections of code that deal with access and enforcement. Now, this page, for those of you that like to use your phone to scan QR codes, we have a QR code on the screen that you can use your cell phone to scan. You can also click on the link that says online resources. These will be distributed after the presentation today. And on this page, you'll find a list of resources. I'm going to actually share that particular screen. So once you click on this document, either through the link or the QR code, you'll find a list of accessible links to the Job Accommodation Network, ADA.gov, the ADA National Network and the Northwest ADA Center, the Idaho Code provisions that deal with this, and finally the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission links as well. So these are resources that you'll have after the fact today.
And we already have a question in the chat, which is, how do we identify an animal if an animal is allowed, if we're not allowed to ask about it? So those were those two key questions. Maybe our next section will help answer that very excellent question.
Yeah, and both the letter and the spirit of the state and federal laws around this are to prevent the disclosure of personal confidential medical information, to limit the amount of information we can ask about when patrons come into the library, but still try to ascertain whether or not this is a legitimate service animal. So we're going to do some role plays here in a minute that I think will kind of illustrate that a little more directly. All right, so I want you to be thinking about these. In a few minutes, we're going to have you engage through the chat, and Linda and I are going to go through some role play scenarios. And we're going to ask you to respond to questions like this. But just so we can move into those discussions, let me just go through these questions here briefly. So yes, an individual can bring a service animal into a state agency, but not an emotional support animal. So if you identify that little Fluffy is just there to provide comfort for an individual, you can exclude them and ask them to not bring their dog into the library. If they answer those two questions and say, yes, this is a trained service animal, and yes, they perform a task, they retrieve items when I drop them because I can't reach down to pick them up, then they are allowed in the library. The difference between a service and emotional support animal: a service animal performs a task, an emotional support animal or comfort animal does not. Does it matter that I have paperwork and a vest? No, it doesn't. And in fact, some people who have a service animal will try to offer that to you and say, well, you can see my animal has a vest on. You can come back to those two questions and say, well, actually under Idaho state law and under the ADA, you're not required to provide a vest or license. We just need to know the answer to these two questions. Finally, if it's obvious what task the service animal provides, for example, someone who is blind or visually impaired, you're not actually allowed under state law in Idaho to ask those two questions. So that's a little tricky. State laws do vary from state to state, but it's a good practice not to ask the questions if the service and the task are obvious. All right, for those of you in Idaho, you'll recognize some of these acronyms. For those of you outside of the state, let me just tell you what these mean. So number one, review the online resources that we've shared. Number two, talk with your deputy attorney generals or other legal counsel. Three, those of you in Idaho can talk to the Division of Human Resources if you have questions about employees and how they're handling these types of requests. And finally, you can also reach out and talk to the Human Rights Commission. We're happy to provide information and resources. Those of you in other states, there are state and local agencies like the Idaho Human Rights Commission that serve your areas and your states. In Washington state, there's a state commission, but there's also local commissions for Seattle, Tacoma, and I believe Olympia as well. All right, let's move on to Title I. I'm going to share a different presentation now. And Linda, thank you for being here today. We're going to talk and bridge between the places of public accommodation and public spaces in Title II with Title I and accommodating service and emotional support animals in the workplace. So again, as in the first part, we're going to talk about both the federal and the state laws and how those overlap. The biggest thing to remember is that when a patron comes into the library, it's very limited what they can do. They can only bring a service animal, and they have to be able to respond affirmatively to those two questions. And you can ask them to leave if the dog becomes unruly, or in Idaho, the miniature horse. When it comes to employment, it's much more broad, and we want to kind of reframe and refocus the discussion on accommodating a person with a disability. And that may include a service animal, it may include a comfort animal or an emotional support animal. The process is different, the questions are different, and how you approach that is different. So we're going to talk today about best practices, what to do, what not to do. We have some examples we're going to share about a supervisor who says the right things and does things well, and also a supervisor who doesn't do things so well and what not to do. And we'll come back to those two questions. So the questions that you can ask a patron, we'll review those here in just a minute. All right, by the end of the presentation today, you should be able to handle service animals in your libraries and also understand the difference between a patron service animal and an employee with a disability who has an accommodation that may be a service animal, a comfort animal, an emotional support animal in the workplace. And then, of course, we'll redirect you as well to those resources again. All right, so let me ask you this. Does the ADA and do state laws apply to the libraries? Just give us a thumbs up or drop a note in the chat here. What do you think? Does the ADA apply to local libraries that are part of local government or state government?
I'm seeing lots of yeses in the chat. This is exactly what we're hoping for. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Now it's confusing because when we use terms like places of public accommodation, those are private businesses. And so libraries aren't privately owned and operated generally. Now, some might be nonprofits or have a foundation or something like that. But either way, whether they're state and local government or private nonprofit, they're covered in one way or another under the ADA. And patrons are allowed to bring service animals. So the two questions, let's go back to the two questions. Number one, the most important question is this a service animal trained to perform a task for an individual with a disability? And most people will say, yeah, of course, this is a service animal, right? Even if it's not. And that's always a concern that's raised. Well, what if somebody's trying to game the system? What if they're trying to pass off their non-service animal? That may happen. And so then you can move to the next question, which is, okay, well, what is the task this service animal is trained to perform? And so those are the two questions, the only two questions. If they can't answer that very well, you can ask them to clarify. But if they're not able to answer those questions, you can ask them to leave or not bring their animal into the library. Again, the same rules apply here in terms of identification. There's no standard identification required. You can remove or exclude animals that are not under control. All right, so let me go back here. We're going to run through a couple of different role play scenarios. And in this first one, I'm going to play the part of what the library employee should do or say when observing and interacting with a patron with a service animal. Linda is going to be the internal monologue of what I'm thinking while I'm observing this individual coming into the library. So we want you to be thinking about, what's good, what's appropriate about what I'm saying, and what perhaps shouldn't be said that Linda is saying in response. So first off, we see a patron walking toward the front doors of the library. And I think to myself, okay, interesting. I think that's a patron walking into the library carrying a small dog.
All right, and the unfiltered part of our stand-in librarian says, okay, a 7-pound Pomeranian Chihuahua mix? No way that's a service animal. Looks like someone's trying to game the system.
Okay. Okay, now the patron is walking toward the front counter. Now, Ben, remember, there are only 2 questions I can ask. Number 1, is the dog a service animal required because of a disability? Now, that's the shortened version. And number 2, what work or task has the dog been trained to perform?
Now, unfiltered librarian thinks, what I really want to know is, why are the little dogs always the most hyper and neurotic? And why would you bring a yappy dog into my nice, quiet library?
Now, it's natural to think these things, right? And oftentimes the first initial reaction is just that, like, come on, you've got to be kidding me, right? But we've got to always go back to that standard and those questions and limit our responses and interactions to those things. So the patron walks in and I say, hello, welcome to the library. I see you have a dog with you. Is the dog a service animal required because of a disability? Yeah, okay, thank you. Well, I have one other question for you. What work or task has the dog been trained to perform?
So unfiltered librarian, Ben, if you could hit once, is thinking, wait, after the patron replies, I'm thinking, how do you train a dog to know when you need to take medication? Is that even a thing? And if so, that's kind of cool. Well, I guess Pomchi can stay. So that's my initial reaction if, we assume the patron answers. Yes, the dog has been trained to help me know when to take medication. That's a task, that's legit. But we're also going to give you another scenario, Ben, if you don't mind hitting one more. Right, what if the patron has a different reply? Here's our next scenario.
So you say your dog has been trained to play fetch with your children to keep them occupied. And that sounds more like a comfort animal or a pet, which we unfortunately don't allow because it's not providing a task or a job related to a disability. So you're welcome to bring a service animal into the library if the service animal is trained to perform a task to support a person with a disability.
And the unfiltered librarian is thinking, no way. Dogs rule, cats rule, but none of them belong in my library, okay?
And this gets tricky too, because regardless of what you might be thinking, and even if you say the right things, oftentimes when people bring a pet and want to say that it's a service animal, but you've identified that it's not, things can escalate, and it doesn't typically just de-escalate and the person walks away. Usually there's more of an interaction. So don't hesitate to bring in your administrator, your supervisor or manager to be involved in that conversation. But know and be confident that if you ask those questions and you identify that it's not a service animal, you're perfectly fine to ask them to not bring the animal in with them. So that's the hard part, is that sometimes we err on the side of, well, we'll just let everybody bring their dog in because we don't want to get in trouble, right? We don't want to face a lawsuit. As long as you're following this guide and these 2 questions and going through these steps, you'll be fine. And that's perfectly acceptable. Okay, so along those lines, I understand your frustration. Would you like to speak to my supervisor?
Where it's unfiltered librarian says, rules are rules. Hasta la vista, fur baby. I think, Ben, we wanted to entertain you with our scenarios, but at the same time, maybe you're also imagining what would it be like to be in the shoes of the patron, right? And how are you likely to respond using Ben's calmer script, more on point, legally complying script versus your maybe initial gut reaction. And we're hoping you hear also the difference. Sometimes it helps to have, what could go wrong and what could go right played out for you. So I'm hoping this scenario really gives you insights into how to keep things from escalating, how to stay focused on what you need to do, and how to be respectful.
And the other thing to keep in mind too, and I don't want anybody to be afraid that anytime somebody comes in with a dog that it's a setup, but there are people around the country that are testers, right? Self-appointed testers in many cases, who come and test businesses and libraries and other places that are open to the public to see if you're going to ask them the right questions, or if you're going to require them to wear a service vest, or those types of things. So again, if you follow the script and you follow the 2 questions and you do things in the way that we're presenting today, you're going to avoid a lot of hassle and headache. We've seen here in Idaho people that come into a store or a library with a recording device, with their phone, recording the interaction, just to see what the person behind the counter will do or say. So it's good to train your staff on this. If you're an administrator or a supervisor here today, feel free to use our slides and to train your staff in this way as well, or reach out to us and we're happy to do customized trainings as well. So let's just review this again. And I know we talked about this a little bit, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time, but can a patron bring an emotional support animal? No. The difference between a service and an emotional support is the task that it performs. It doesn't matter whether there's a vest or any kind of paperwork, even if the person with the dog provides that, you don't need to see that, you don't need to request it. And in fact, under certain state laws like Idaho, it's prohibited to do so. And then don't ask the question if it's obvious. Okay, let's shift gears and talk about reasonable accommodation. I mentioned that it's different for patrons than employees. And accommodating employees with service or emotional support animals is no different than any other reasonable accommodation. So if you're an employee, you can ask for a reasonable accommodation to help you do your job. And that may include having a service or emotional support animal with you at work. It may also involve non-animal related things like having a stand-up desk or a wider access point in a door for your wheelchair, those types of things. The process is exactly the same, and the requirements are the same for both parties, the employee and the employer. You have to engage in the interactive process. You have to make a request known. Employers, you have to engage in that process and find a reasonable accommodation that will enable the person to do the job. And there are some exceptions, and we're not going to get too far into that. But just remember, the ADA process for reasonable accommodation is the same for service animals, emotional support animals, or any other accommodation. So employers, what do you want to do? Number one, listen for accommodation requests. There's no magic language or formula. If an employee says to you, I'm really struggling here and I don't have my service animal with me at work and that's making it really hard for me to do certain things, the light bulb should go off, right? And you should recognize immediately, okay, this is an ADA accommodation request. Let's talk with HR. Let's sit down. Let's create a more formal process for evaluating that. Be creative. We had, there's a case nationally, and some of you may have heard of this, an individual, there was a court case around this, but an individual asked to bring in cockroaches in a box. Now, it sounds crazy. It sounds really unusual. And most of us would go, no way, we're not having cockroaches here in the office. But the supervisor was creative and said, okay, well, why do you need that? What is it that this helps you with in your day to day? And the individual said, well, the sound is really soothing to me and I have a neuroprocessing disorder. And that actually helps me focus on my work. And so they worked out a creative solution, which was to create a recording of that sound that that individual could play without actually physically bringing the cockroaches into the office. And that worked. That was a reasonable accommodation related to an animal, insect in this case. So let me ask you, and drop this in the chat, what would that fall under? So it's an ADA accommodation in the workplace, number one. But is this a service animal performing a task, or is it a emotional support animal / insect? How would you view that? Just type it into the chat what your thoughts are. Okay, comfort support, emotional support. Yeah. So the cockroaches haven't been trained and they're not doing any tasks or providing any kind of work for the individual. So this definitely falls in that emotional support, comfort animal / insect. It's highly unusual. You won't see many of those. But whereas a patron coming into the library couldn't bring an emotional support or comfort animal, an employee may incorporate that into an accommodation request. Yeah, excellent. Check in with your employees, right? See how the accommodation is going. Don't assume that it's related to a disability. Ask the questions. Now, when identifying a service animal for a patron, you can only ask the 2 questions. With employees, you can get much more into the details of the type of disability, what is needed to accommodate that disability, and asking for supportive documentation from the medical provider. Now, we don't have time today to go into all of the ADA interactive process and accommodations steps. But again, just know that if an employee asks to bring their service animal or an emotional support animal, it's the same process for any other accommodation. All right, anything else to add there, Linda?
Yeah, it seems to me as I'm thinking about what you said previously for patron animals versus employment accommodation. In the first situation, you do want to distinguish, is it service animal or is it comfort animal? Whereas for your employee asking for an accommodation, really you're focused more on, is this a reasonable accommodation, right? So you don't have to make the distinction of whether it's comfort or service. Instead, you're just, verifying the disability and thinking about the accommodation and what works and engaging in that interactive process.
Excellent. So the next scenario we're going to do, so we're going to talk about a supervisor working with employees and what to say and what not to say. So let me back off of that slide for just 1 second. So we're moving away from the patron interaction. We'll come back to that in a minute. But right now, I want you to think about a scenario where we have an employee who has a service animal or even an emotional support animal that has been approved as an accommodation to assist them in doing their job. The supervisor then is going to interact both with that employee and with the other employees in the office or in the library. And we're going to see, again, a back and forth of what probably shouldn't be said and what is kind of the ideal of what could and should be said in that situation.
You know what, Ben? I think I goofed and I took off the animations. We were going to have it come in and allow you to give us a response. And since I goofed that, maybe you can first, we're going to switch it around and have the unfiltered librarian say something. And we wanted to ask you your input on how you might rephrase. So maybe before we show the next slide, I'll go ahead and set up the scenario, say what the unfiltered librarian wants to say, and then after we get audience input, we'll go to the next slide. What do you think about that,
And-
Ben?
Yeah, so Linda, I actually have an earlier version just of these slides here that we can use with the animation. And then we can switch back to the other one. So let me just share this one.
I'm
very-
so sorry about that. I was
No,
trying to
that's
make
okay.
it
That's okay.
508 compliant, and I think I messed up the animations.
No worries. So we'll just do this and then we'll switch back to the other presentation. So, okay, Linda, take it away with what not to say.
All right, so picture yourself as HR or supervisor, and your employee asks to bring an animal to work. Here is unfiltered librarian saying, how can we let you have a dog at work? If we say yes to you, everyone will want to bring in their pets too. What about all the mess, the stink, hair, and noise? What's our liability if your dog bites or if a patron has allergies? All right, consider what I just said. Tell me what's wrong with what I said. And in the chat, go ahead and identify what are the problems with what I've said, and can you rephrase it? We're looking for your suggestions. How would you want to handle this? An employee request to bring an animal to work. Any thoughts from the audience in the chat?
And while you're typing and thinking, you know, even though this isn't presented how we would want it, it does raise some important issues, right? About conflicting interests. What about allergies? What if you have another employee who has allergies to pet dander? So it's not that these are illegitimate concerns, but how we address those and how we go about those matters.
Okay, I'm not seeing anything in the chat yet.
Let's jump to a model of what this could look like. And then as we go to the next slide, just be thinking, and you can be typing as we see the initial dialogue there. So let's talk about, yeah, that's good. First, ask why the employee needs a dog and don't assume the outcome.
Great.
That's excellent. So now that we've approved your accommodation to have your service animal with you here at work, let's talk about how we'll discuss that with your coworkers, just to make sure we maintain confidentiality about your disability and other medical information. So notice how I'm setting that up to maintain confidentiality, but then addressing the reality that everybody's going to notice that the service animal is here. So would it be okay if we simply say something like, Maria will have her service dog with her at work? What other ideas do you have? Okay, so in this scenario, we're putting it back on the employee to say, what are you comfortable with and how would you like me to explain this to other staff? Because they're going to have questions. So that's a good way to approach that. And Steve, to your question, what about the coworker with a phobia to that type of an animal or an allergy? We're going to talk in a bit about balancing those different accommodations. So if somebody has an anxiety disorder and has a disability related to that, then we're going to have to figure out how to balance both of those accommodations.
And there's really great points brought up in the chat, the idea of first asking why the employee needs the dog and not making assumptions. I think that's a great approach.
Mm-hmm.
And I like when Lynette says about, tell me why you want to do this. And Jacqueline points out, we shouldn't make assumptions that everybody will bring in their pet, right? So I think a lot of people are identifying what was wrong with that initial reaction. Now we're moving on to the next step of letting coworkers and possibly volunteers who work with Maria, letting them know that Maria will be bringing a dog into the workplace. So again, unfiltered librarian says, and please identify what might be a problem with this. Maria gets to have a dog at work because of her disability, all right? The rest of you can't have a pet at work, so don't ask. And don't ask me about her disability because it's all confidential. Okay, So what's the problem with what Unfiltered Librarian says here? Feel free to chime in the chat. You can identify what went wrong, or you can come up with alternate ideas of what you might say. Yes, Unfiltered Librarian's pretty aggressive, probably not ideal boss. Thank you. Good tone check. Right. She says it's confidential, but she's already just saying that Maria has a disability. That's a total violation. Yes.
And it
Right.
really raises more questions, right? By phrasing it this way, don't ask me about her disability. It's all confidential, right? That raises more questions than it answers. And it opens the door to the question, well, what is her disability? Why does she need a service dog, right? Whereas the earlier conversation of Maria will have her service animal with her. And then, individually, if Maria cares to share any more information with her coworkers, that's up to her. But from the library perspective, you're limiting that information to a very specific script and very limited information. It's obvious that the dog's there. Something should be said, but you can limit it to simply Maria has her service animal with her here at work.
So Ben, are you going to share what a possible way of handling it?
Yeah, so this is a little more friendly way, perhaps, of welcoming the service animal here. I want to welcome the newest member of our team. This is Thor. Maria's service dog, Thor, will be here at the library with Maria. If you have any questions about that, please come and talk with me anytime. Now, that seems to kind of open the door as well, but you also want to keep in mind, like what Steve mentioned earlier, what about a coworker who has an allergy or a severe phobia with an anxiety disorder or some other need for accommodation? So you do want to leave the door open for that conversation. It doesn't mean that you're going to then share all of Maria's medical information with that other staff member. So you're still going to keep it confidential. And if somebody asks point blank, well, what does Maria need this service dog for? Say, well, that's confidential and a personnel matter, and I can't share that with you. But if you have a disability and need an accommodation, then we can talk about what that looks like for you. Right. So that's a good way to kind of pivot and divert away from the other employee back to the employee asking the question.
So there's questions about, can you ask the individual with the dog if it's okay to share brief info, which was kind of what we were hoping to model in that previous scenario where before we have the team meeting, we meet with Maria and ask her what she's comfortable saying to other people, get her buy-in ahead of time, to Lynette's question. And Jackie's saying, can you say service dog? Will that scream disability? Is that the equivalent of saying disability?
Yeah, and so that's very similar. In this case, we're using the term service dog, which does, alert others to know that there is a disability accommodation in place. But that's no different from letting other staff members know that there's an accommodation in place generally. Now, this often comes up when we have people that are required to do on-call shifts, and maybe somebody is exempted from that requirement. And so you can't generally just ignore that fact when employees have questions. They have legitimate questions why somebody is being treated differently. And so it's perfectly fine to say, well, this is an accommodation that's in place. And if you have a need for an accommodation, then let's talk about that. The reality is there's no realistic way to completely avoid discussion of the accommodation in the workplace because other staff, other employees are going to be impacted by that. So the goal is to limit the information that's shared to only identify that as an accommodation and not get into the specifics beyond that. But that's okay to mention. All right, just for the sake of time, we're going to go ahead and move to these next ones. And Ezekiel, let me just respond to your question. Is there a time when accommodation would be unreasonable? Absolutely. And now this gets more into the accommodations process. EEOC has some wonderful resources on this. What constitutes an undue burden or a hardship on the business? If somebody says, I need to have another full-time employee that does my work for me as an accommodation, That's clearly unreasonable and not expected of any business or any agency to do. So there are accommodation requests that are not reasonable. EEOC.gov is probably your best resource on that and different examples. All right, Linda.
All right, so here, talking about what's reasonable or unreasonable, Maria is asking for additional breaks. She already has breaks, but she's asking for additional breaks in order to take her service dog outside to go to the bathroom, like 2 to 3 times each day. Here is unfriendly, grumpy, unfiltered librarian's response. What? That's not fair to your colleagues if I give you extra breaks. How can you pull your weight when you disappear all the time with your dog?
What we really should say is, let me see what we can do to help with that accommodation. And now here's the creative piece, right? Are you able to take Thor out during your regular breaks in the morning and afternoon and at lunch? Can we start with that and then adjust the times of your breaks? And if that doesn't work, let's talk more about either clocking out and making up that time at the end of the day, or adjusting your daily schedule a bit to make that accommodation. Do you have any other ideas that could work so that you're still putting in your 40 hours, but getting Thor out to the bathroom on a regular schedule? Now, this is really important because for a lot of state and local government employees who are classified or hourly, they are required to do 40 hours per week. And an accommodation is not an exemption from that requirement. So in other words, an employee can't be paid for 40 hours if they've only clocked in and performed 35 hours of work. So this is where it has to be creative to say, how do we still meet that requirement of the job, but allow an accommodation that meets all of the different needs? So Thor has a need as a service animal, needs to go to the bathroom. We don't want to have accidents in building. So how can we flex or adjust the schedule so that the employee's getting the 40 hours, but Thor's also able to do the bathroom breaks, and we're implementing that accommodation? So creativity matters. I know that's difficult with set scheduled hours. That can be tricky, but that is the requirement of the ADA and state law as well.
All right, in this episode, we see Thor has a barking episode, scares a patron and her 2-year-old child. So here's the unfiltered reaction. Maria, Thor is out of control and has got to go. We can't have him scaring patrons, and especially the children. This is just not going to work out.
So instead of the kind of reactive, we're going to cut it off response, let's talk about how to moderate this. So as we discussed when we set up the accommodation, your service animal must be under your control at all times and well behaved. Barking at a patron violates that ADA standard, and we need to make sure that doesn't happen again. So what can you do with Thor to make sure that doesn't happen again? So it puts the responsibility back on the employee. We're not just cutting off the accommodation, but we are setting those expectations and boundaries. All right, the last one, and I want to move into this because I know we're coming up on the end of the hour. We've got about 12 minutes till noon Mountain Time. So let's talk about when worlds collide. We have a service animal with a patron, and we have an approved accommodation of a service or emotional support animal with a staff member. So we have a patron dog and an employee dog. What's going to happen? It's like a cage match right there in the library. So how do we handle that?
All right, so in this case, we're wondering, let's say patron dog Pomchi meets up with Thor's service animal. Is there anything we want to do to make sure that the patron realizes there's another service dog in the library? Unfiltered librarian is thinking, oh, great, another dog in my library. But perhaps we could word that more tactfully and informatively.
So again, now we've talked about accommodations. Now let's switch gears back to the patron. We have our 2 questions, right? Number 1, is the dog a service animal required because of a disability or to support someone with a disability? And number 2, what work or task has the dog been trained to perform? Now, talking to the patron, just so you know, we have another service animal here behind the front desk. Thor is a trained, well-behaved service animal. We just want to make sure there isn't any conflict or interaction between the dogs, just so that we're both able to have our service animals here.
And as Tara points out in the chat, if they're trained service dogs, they should be fine.
Right, right.
However, in this scenario, we start to hear some growling and some barking. Unfiltered librarians' responses. This is a library, not a dog park. I knew letting dogs into my library would be a bad idea.
So the patron dog starts to bark and lunge over the counter at Thor, right? What do we do? So here's kind of a frank response. Oh, wow. Hi there, little guy. Looks like he's excited to see Thor. So we just need to make sure that your service animal is under your control at all times. If you can make sure he's under your control, we'll make sure Thor stays here at the front desk while you're visiting the library. Thanks so much, and please let us know if you need any assistance today. Now, if the patron's not able to get their service animal under control, that's the point at which you can ask them to remove the animal. They're, of course, welcome to come back without the animal, but the animal, if it's not under control, can be asked to leave.
And in this scenario, we're picturing Tomchi has broken away from the owner, knocked down a display of books, and said, and has actually scared a child and caused a cry. Worst case scenario. Unfiltered librarian, strike 3 and you're out. That's it. You and your dog are banned from the library.
And just a side note, I think, Linda, you and I are both going to get offers to be hired for a library. I just know it, just based on these scenarios. Okay, so what we want to say is, sir, I'm sorry for the inconvenience, but I need to ask you to take your service animal out of the library because he's not under your control. It's important for our other patrons that a service animal is under its owner's control at all times, and we can't have a service animal running loose through the library. Thanks for understanding. I appreciate that. Now, what we're doing here is not just being, formulaic and formal, but we are referencing the different elements of the law under the ADA and state law that are important to reiterate, right? A service animal must be under its owner's control at all times. And so by referring to that, if there are any concerns or complaints or follow-up that happen after that, you can go back and say, well, here's what we said. Here's why it complies, and here we took it directly from the ADA and state law. So that's really important. All right, before we go on to the resources, I did want to mention just a couple of other things. We have, here at the Human Rights Commission, we have commissioners who are also business people and professionals in the community, and one of them owns a restaurant, and they had a dog come into the restaurant, and there are videos of this particular dog aggressively attacking individuals, and these are posted on Facebook. And the individual said, well, this is my service dog. It provides protection for me when I'm out in public. So my question to you, is that a service animal? Is that a task being performed that this dog can attack and defend? Absolutely not, right? And so you may encounter that. You may have a patron that comes in, and when you ask them the two questions, they say, well, this is a service defense dog, or this is a dog that protects me because I'm very nervous when I go out in public and I need that protection. A protective animal is not a service animal, and that explicitly does not qualify under state and federal law. So that's good to keep in mind. I think at this point, I'll leave this screen up here as we move into the questions. Are there questions that you have that have come up through this? I know we've got a few minutes left. Yeah, and Kristen, that's a good question. Why not if it's been trained for that specific task? I think the public policy interest there, so I'm kind of thinking from the legal side of things and the law side of things, is that becomes more of a risk to the public than a protective or a service being performed for the individual with the disability. Now, that gets into some theoretical questions, right? I see Tiara is putting in there, if they're not physically able to protect themselves, But the question is from what or from whom, right? So that would kind of move it more into the realm of a comfort animal. If there's truly a psychological or mental health disability, and they feel unsafe or they feel threatened, then that should be dealt with a comfort animal, which unfortunately is not allowed in public places or places of public accommodation. So the real question is, what task does this perform to assist you? And striking out and defending you from actual or perceived threats is not a qualifying task under the ADA. Yeah, okay, Jacqueline, we have a dog that is often brought into the library. The patron often leaves the dog off leash and will leave the dog in the library to go smoke a cig outside or to use the restroom. So in that case, even though, let's say you do determine that it's a service dog, then you can absolutely ask the patron to maintain it under their control at all times, inside, outside, in the restroom, whatever that may be. So that's a great example of where you can set more boundaries and expectations. And that's a very real thing, right? Because you don't want to get in trouble or have a lawsuit or have a complaint, but you can be confident to know that if it's not under the owner's control, you can ask them to do so.
I noticed that Jacqueline mentions that this dog was not a service dog. I remember when we were talking through this training, it may be that certain libraries have broader policies. We want to encourage people to be consistent, and also bring them up to date with what the law says. So if, for instance, a library has had the past policy of allowing dogs to come in, whether or not they're for comfort, service, or a pet, how would you approach that? Oh, and another great question. Do service animals have to be on leash at all times in public spaces?
Yeah, so that goes back to being under the owner's control. And arguably, if they're not on leash or if they're not physically handled, so some individuals who are blind or visually impaired will have a harness. And that's also an acceptable way of restraining an animal or maintaining it under control. And as Melissa points out, it really is the focus on the behavior of the animal. State laws oftentimes, like in Idaho, govern specifically being on leash. As you'll see in the resources, I've listed the Idaho State Code provisions that are specifically for disability rights protections under the Human Rights Act, but also the service animal statute that lists all of that in detail, what's allowed, what's required of all parties involved. So look to state law for the specifics, and the ADA generally for the Title I areas. Title II for public spaces. And as Jacqueline points out, counties and cities may also have ordinances, and often do when it comes to maintaining animals under control. And that would be for both pets and service animals. All right, Annie, I see we're coming to the end of the hour, and we'll turn it back over to you. Thanks so much for having us today.
Yeah, thank you so much for this presentation. I really enjoyed the role-playing aspect. I thought that was a really great way to talk through some of these thorny conversations. So thank you for that. I really appreciate it.
Yeah.
And thank you. And so all of the attendees are going to get a copy of the slides, which will have a link to these amazing resources that Ben has collected for us. As you exit, you'll be prompted to complete a evaluation. And as always, we appreciate your honest feedback. Thank you so much for attending today, and we hope you have a good afternoon.